بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ما بعد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. This is lesson number 2, second lesson that we're having, going through the book اختصار علوم الحديث by الحافظ ibn Kathir. Now we haven't even begun speaking about the book, and I did this for a particular reason, and that was to kind of give you guys a proper introduction to the science of hadith beforehand. And I think that's quite important, especially because I was informed that many of the students in this first time encountering such a book, and so it's important that we're properly grounded before we even think about tackling this book, this work by Ibn Kathir in the science of hadith. And so we want to do that. So this is going to be the last lesson. It's going to be another. Today's lesson won't be too long, and that's because I have another commitment, subhanAllah, that came up with family. But we're just going to finish speaking about the introduction of the science of hadith, and next week is we're going to begin the actual book. Okay, and it's going to be quite easy from there. But it's very, very important that we ground ourselves in understanding what this science is. And today's lesson, inshallah, is going to be speaking a lot about the history of this science, of this particular science. Okay, we know that the sciences of Islam, whether it's fiqh or tafsir or hadith or even tajweed, qiraat, all of these, they have histories. Okay, they were passed through scholars, they were passed through generations, and so the science as we know it today wasn't the same science as the scholars of the past knew, and even before them. It went through formative periods in which this science as we know today was formed, and even as generations go by, it will continue to change and develop. Okay, it went through stages of development. Now, last week we spoke a bit about what this science is, what it kind of speaks about, and we were speaking about the importance of it also, and we came across these two important, quotes. One was by Ibn Barak, where he said, "Isnad isnad qala man sha'a ma sha'a." That the isnad is part of the religion. We said, why isnad? Because essentially, what we're dealing with in the science of hadith is mostly the isnad. Okay, mostly the isnad. Okay, and were it not the isnad, the chain of narration, anyone could say whatever they wished. They could attribute whatever they wanted to Islam. Okay, and Muhammad ibn Sirin, what did he say? Everyone loves this quote, don't they? We always hear it, especially us in the West. إن هذا العلم دين فانظروا عمن تأخذون دينكم. Indeed, this knowledge is religion. This deen, this knowledge that we have is religion, and religion itself is knowledge. So look carefully from who you take your religion from. Of course, not to be used, for tashaddud, not to be used to be severe towards other Muslims, which is why many Muslims these days unfortunately use this quote of Muhammad Siddin. That's not how he meant it. He meant it from the sense of this particular science of hadith. That this deen is full of is narration. Okay, this deen is narration. It was passed through rijal. Okay, it was passed through scholars, through people, men and women, and so it's important that we know who these people are. Okay, in order to verify, if this is part of the deen of Islam or not. Okay, so today what we're going to do is look at something which is known as manahij al-muhaddithin, the methodology of the scholars when it comes to في التثبت من صحة الأخبار, in verifying the the accuracy of reports, specifically in hadith. Okay, so this process of what's called a tathabbut, of verification, okay, or tasheeh, some people might call it, which is to verify a particular report or transmission. Okay, this is something that was developed even at the time of the companions, and it went through so many generations of development up until today. We have this whole manhaj. Okay, we speak about manhaj not to be used as how people always ask, "What's your manhaj? What's your manhaj?" We're talking about the actual manhaj, the manhaj of the muhaddithin in regards to how they went about to verify reports, and this is quite important. Okay, how do we? Because this actual science of hadith in itself is just a study of which, especially today, is just a study of, or how did this scholar come to the conclusion that this hadith is either verified, this hadith is authentic or hasan or da'if or whatever it may be. Okay, what we're doing essentially now, this day and age, is just understanding how scholars came to the conclusion in regards to accepting hadith or rejecting hadith. That's essentially what we're doing, and this is a general Islamic principle. Okay, verification of reports is a general Islamic principle. Okay, and some scholars say it's a logical principle. Okay, it's a fitri principle. We always talk about fitra. What fitra means? Fitra means something that is, Allah created us with it. Okay, It's a general life principle also. And we find this in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِذَا جَاءَكُمْ فَاسِقٌ بِنَبَإٍ فَتَبَيَّنُوا. Oh, you who believe, if a sinful person comes to you with news, then verify it. Verify it. And in another qira'ah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَتَثَبَّتُوا. من التثبت. So verify it. Okay? Make sure what he's saying is correct. Do your checks. Have a look at who we took it from. And what we're doing in hadith, we're doing exactly what this ayah commands us to do. Number one, by firstly finding out if that person is a sinful person. And this is why we're going to go into it. We have something called al-jarh wa ta'dil, which is a science and the science of hadith, which is to check if a person is essentially sinful or not, meaning can he carry this hadith? If he can, then that's fine. If he can't, then we have to verify. Who did you take it from? Okay. Did he take it from a sinful person? Okay. How do you take it? And questions continue. But what I'm trying to say is this is a general Islamic principle. Give me 1 second, guys, so I can open up the chat while on the meeting. It doesn't seem to let me. So if you have any questions, inshallah, drop it in the chat as we. Okay, now the Sunnah also reinforces this principle. Okay, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Whoever narrates from me a hadith which he believes to be false is one of liars. من تعمد علي متعمد من كذب عليه متعمدا فليتبوأ مقعده في النار." Whoever lies he has saved his spot in the hellfire. Okay, many ahadith. We have also a famous narration which I should have put up here, but I'll put it in the group perhaps. Was al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu, where he literally. Okay, jazakallah khair, shabab. So al-Khattab radiallahu anhu did this exact same thing. But one of the companions in the majlis, he mentioned a hadith, and al-Khattab said, "You either tell me if you either show by the Prophet saying this, or I'll have your head." This is al-Khattab doing exactly what hadith scholars do, which is verifying reports. What I'm trying to get at here is that this methodology of making sure that these ahadith are accurate is something that can be found in the time of the companions, at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Of course, it wasn't needed that much compared to today. At the time the Prophet was around, he was alive. Someone could go up to him and be like, "Did you say, O Rasulullah?" And he would say, "Yes, I did." Okay, and so the hadith scholars today, they apply this methodology of at-tathabbut, verification. And from the time of the companions until today, they still exercise great caution when accepting and transmitting reports. Okay, there's numerous examples in the Sunnah where they would carefully verify reports. Okay, they would take caution in accepting narrations, precision in transmission. Okay, and of course, like we said, this wasn't so common at the time of the companions because the Prophet was around. But we'd see, and we read, the seerah and how the tadween, the formation of this science, will discover that this became a more necessary science. This became a more necessary science to take. Understand? Now, what are the key features of this methodology? This methodology is what we're studying. What are the key features of it? Essentially, everything we speak here is everything we're going to study in the kitab. It's kind of setting you up here to kind of give you guys an idea of what we're actually going to be studying in this book. Okay, because essentially this book is a study of methodology. Okay, study of methodology. And we'll speak about whose methodology is later on. So, the first key feature from the methodology of the scholars of hadith is reliance on the isnad. Heavy reliance on the isnad. The requirement for isnad itself, verifying the authenticity of that chain is something we're going to study. Okay, refusing to accept what's transmitted with that isnad. What do we call that type of chain? The different names we have for chains, the different halat, the different cases that a isnad can have. We're going to study that in this kitab, in this book. Okay, number 2, establishing conditions for accepting reports. These conditions are related to, number 1, the rawi, the narrator. Also the marwiyat, the narrations itself. Also the asani, the chains of transmission, the thing that links the narrators together. And also the mutun, the text of hadith. All these 4 things we're going to be studying. For example, the types of narrators that we have, the types of narrations that we have, the types of asani that we have, a broken chain, a complete chain, a half complete. These types we're going to go through, inshallah. We're going to study in this book. And lastly, the mutun, we're not going to be studying, of course, we're not doing riwayah here. It's more to understand is how did this chain of transmission link with the method. Okay. Number 3 is development of numerous hadith sciences. The development of numerous hadith sciences. Some people think that علوم الحديث only covers one thing, which is just to study asanid, the chain of narrations. That's not true. In this book, we'll discuss the fact that narrators are spoken about, narrations are spoken about, chains are spoken about, texts are also spoken about. Okay, and each of these 4 things have their own science. For example, from the sciences that are taken away from narrators is jarh al-ta'dil. From the science taken away from marwiyat, we find kutub al-hadith. From the science that take away from asanid are many. For example, this one we're going to study. From the science that take away from mutun is, for example, fiqh sunnah. Okay, so each of these have branched out to create their own sciences, all under the category of ulum al-hadith. Number 4 is extensive study of narrators. We'll realize over the course of this book that there was so much attention that was given to examining the lives and reliability of these narrators. Okay, and we realize, subhanAllah, the extent some of these scholars went to just to find out about one narrator and his reliability. Okay, we'll realize the importance of recording the biographies, and we'll even tackle some texts. My idea is that practically we want to be able to open up these books and see for ourselves. Okay, and if you stay with us in the course, you'll inshallah pick up that skill. I want to be able to teach you guys how to find out the reliability of a narrator without relying on, I don't know, like a website, or how to do it yourself. How you can go out and access these biographies and check the reliability of the narrators. Okay, it's a skill to have and something that we want to learn, inshallah, throughout this course. Okay, assessing their precision and trustworthiness. There's something, also a skill that the hadithun have, and something you want to pick up. And authorizing specialized work on these subjects. Some of these books we're going to be going to also. So the good thing about this course is that we're not going to be looking at this book. We're also going to be kind of, diving into other books and seeing how you relate to. Open up the kutub al-rijal, we'll open up the kutub of hadith and stuff like that, and we'll come back, inshallah. The kutub al-jarh al-ta'dil. We'll pick up these practical skills. Okay, this science is a very practical science. It's not like other sciences which are very logic based or very thinking based, qiyas based. Okay, it's not like some of these other, or it's not some of these other sciences. They're very hands-on science. It requires you to go out and search, and that requires skill, and we'll learn that, subhanallah. Okay, number 5 is comparing and evaluating narrations. So the scholars carefully compared different narrations by examining their chains, comparing the wordings, identifying contradictions, weighing stronger reports against weaker ones. This is what we're going to learn. We're going to learn how to examine chains. We're going to learn how to compare wordings. We're going to learn how to identify contradictions. And we're going to learn how to weigh out stronger reports against weaker ones and the principles behind it. This is what ulum al-hadith is. We want to learn this methodology. That's what we're going to do. Now, let's talk a bit about the history of this science, علوم الحديث, or in particular مصطلح الحديث, which is essentially what we're going to be studying in this book. Listen about the history. How did اختصار علوم الحديث come about? Did Ibn Kathir just come out and just say, oh, I have this idea of مصطلح hadith, I'm going to name this hadith صحيح and حسن and ضعيف and مدرج and غريب and مشهور and عزيز? No, there was aiming stages, there was development that took place. And so we'll learn a bit about the history of how we got there. Okay. Now, starting off right from the beginning, which is where hadith started off, is the company of our beloved messenger, alayhi salatu wassalam, and the companions that were around him, ridwanullah alayhim. So this generation that was closest to the Prophet, okay, this generation here, the companions, were directly with the Prophet, so they were able to verify a hadith and reports with ease, okay, because the Prophet was there. And if the Prophet was there, they can easily go to other companions. Okay, and something we learn about during our time in this book is that all the companions are trustworthy. Okay, they've been classed with trustworthiness. So it started off at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and we'll see that even at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there was this methodology of verifying reports. Even at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, how did they verify? Either with the Prophet themselves or with another companion. But what we're trying to say is that even at the time of the Prophet verified reports existed. علوم الحديث in a way, okay, not as we know it today, but in a way, تثبت and تصحيح and تضعيف existed back then. So you'll see some of these Western academics that come today. I'm saying this now because I'm currently a master's, and the that I choose now is in my current paper right now is on the science of hadith. And subhanAllah, you read some of the Western academics and their criticism in hadith, and you think, subhanAllah, juhal, kuffar. They understand nothing about how the Prophet ﷺ, even himself back then, there was an emergence of mustalah hadith, ulum hadith, even back then. You know? So it's important that we understand this. Okay, number two is the integrity of the companion. Okay, number one, we already know this. I'm about to tell you now that the companions are all adul. They're known for the honesty and trustworthiness, and they would always have a fear of attributing falsehood to the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, so now we're going past the generation there. Another thing about that time over there is قلة أهل البدع والأهواء. There wasn't the amount of liars that we have today. There was no need to lie. Okay, the iman was different. There was no thing as innovation and made up reports. There was no WhatsApp hadith going around where if you read this, you know those auntie WhatsApp hadith that we get. If you read this hadith, something many times, the Prophet said this and he said, we didn't have that back then because there was no emergence of these sectarian groups or liars or innovators. It had to become widespread here, even not all at the time of the companions. Okay? But what did happen is, as the generations went by, and we find ourselves now in the era of the tabi'un, okay, the ones who followed the companions, and even the tabi'in, okay, the people who followed the tabi'in, where now innovation became widespread. Also, the number of narrators who narrating hadith also increased. There were so many now reporters of hadith. The companions, there were just a few. I mean, I say a few, but everyone knew each other. But now we're in a different ballgame. There's narrators that we don't even know who they are. Okay, because there's so many. Islam had spread to all corners of the world. Okay, and that's scary because you don't know who that person is. Back then we did. Now we don't know who he is. Scholars were also going around traveling with the ahadith and their narrations that they took from the companions. Okay, not only that, but then we had the sectarian movements that were started. Okay, there's a really important book that I think everyone should read. It's called Tadween al-Sunnah Nabawiyya. Okay, send it inshallah, but it's an amazing book that I think everyone should have a read. And he talks about how this science of Sunnah and how Sunnah came about. Okay, let me see if I can find. I'll send it to the group chat, inshallah. And he talks about basically the emergence of the Sunnah from first year after of Hijri all the way up until I believe the 9th. Okay, and it's by Dr. Muhammad Zahrani. Okay, Muhammad Zahrani. I'll find his book and I'll send it to you. But it's a book that I benefited from a lot, and even goes into some of the political stuff that happened during that time that led to a need for ulum al-hadith. It led to a need for ulum al-hadith. Okay, so as a result, all of these things started to happen, and it became more common for scholars to start to verify. Whereas it wasn't very common at the time of the companions. Now it became so common. The Salaf were very, very careful because now there was a need to ask where you got the hadith from. Before there wasn't because you knew that person was. But now I don't know you. I need to ask who you are. There was more investigation that was happening. Okay. And then through that came this generation of two types of people. نقد الرواة ونقد المرويات. And those were the tawfiq of Allah Azza wa Jal. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed from that generation a group of scholars to rise who were critiquing narrators and also evaluating narrations. Muhaddithin, as we call them today. Scholars involved in the science of hadith. They came as a result of what? As a result of the need. There was no need for them back then, time of the companions. But now, time of tabi'in and tabi'in, there was a need for them. Because lying spreaded. The sectarian movements started to evolve. Political movements started to evolve, started to form. And these political movements push out fake hadith. There's so many examples of that in Islamic history. Okay, and so we find in this period, during the period of the tabi'in and tabi'in, that the foundational principles of hadith criticism and the science of hadith, you could say, started to come out. We can start to see, if you read these, what they're doing, scholars of hadith back then, they were essentially a form of science of hadith. They were practicing the sciences of hadith back then. Of course, not as developed as we now need it now, but they needed to develop back then. And so years would go by, and what happens? Narrators increase. The need for ulum al-hadith becomes so needed. Why? Because praying about hadith left, right, center. And so the need for this science of hadith becomes almost wajib. And through that came the scholars of hadith. Through that also came their works, which is now known as what? Ulum al-hadith. Or we could say mustalah al-hadith, the classification of hadith. So it's not something they just spout out of nowhere. Some Western academics would say, or even some people would say that we don't believe in this classification of hadith is hadith. We say no. The science of hadith didn't just come out of scholars' pockets. It didn't come from their head. It came from a necessary need, and that need started even at the time of the companions, ridwanullah alayhim. Okay, so we can kind of there's three main stages that the science of hadith went through. There's three main stages that the science of hadith went through. Al-marhat al-ula, for those of you guys who must speak Arabic, the first stage is bidayat tadween. Okay, what does tadween mean? Formation. The beginning of the formation of the science of hadith. بداية تدوين ايش؟ علوم الحديث. المرحلة الأولى. المرحلة الثانية الاستقلال والجمع. That's the second level, second stage. And the last stage is الترتيب والتحرير. And this stage is actually, you could argue, still happening today. So let's go through it stage by stage. First stage is the beginning of codification for the sciences of hadith. The beginning of the codification of hadith. When did this start? It started around late 2nd century Hijrah, approximately into the middle of the 4th century after Hijrah. Okay, and during this period, the mustalah hadith wasn't really found. There was no such thing as sahih or da'if or all the classifications that we have today. Mustalah hadith didn't really exist. But what did exist and what was written down was principles and discussions. We'll speak about these books that came out during that time. We'll have a look at them. Principles and discussions that came out. From the principles, for example, this person is very, very weak. Don't take hadith from him. This person is very reliable. If you see him in a chain of narration, yes, that's good. This chain of narration here with these groups of people, mashallah, well done, we can take from them. These are the types of principles and discussions that were happening and put down into books. But there wasn't independent books of hadith or ulum al-hadith. There weren't independent books of hadith during this stage. Rather, these topics and these principles and discussions came throughout other works. You'd find it sometimes in the books of hadith. Or you'd find it in books of fiqh even. You'd find it in books of aqidah. Okay? They were scattered. Okay? He wasn't given his own science yet. He wasn't given his own name yet. Okay? He hadn't yet emerged as a distinct and independent discipline during this time. Okay? For example, some of the books that came out during this time was Kitab al-Risala, Imam al-Shafi'i, an important text work on usul fiqh by Imam al-Shafi'i. Not even usul fiqh, many other sciences actually. Okay, and in this he speaks also about some of the principles and discussions that if you read about, you think, wait a minute, this is ulum al-hadith. This is ulum al-hadith. Of course, it wasn't known anything as then. But Imam al-Shafi'i saw a need for it, and so he mentioned it. Muqaddimat Sahih Muslim. Imam Muslim, when he compiled his ahadith, before that he had a muqaddimah, he had an introduction. In that introduction, he lays out some principles and laying foundations for the sciences of hadith. And of course, Imam Muslim, he didn't know what this, he didn't know that years later, or generations later, that people look at his work and be like, oh, that's mustalah al-hadith, or that's jarh al-ta'dith. Now, Muslim wasn't writing it for that purpose. He just saw it as something that was needed, and we know it today as science of hadith. We have also another famous book called At-Tamyiz, which is a short book by Imam Muslim, which is literally in the science of hadith. We have Imam al-Tirmidhi's work, Kitab al-Ill al-Saghir, where Imam al-Tirmidhi wrote his famous Jami', he compiled his hadith. He also wrote Kitab al-Ill al-Saghir, which is with us today, and Kitab al-Kabir, which is only a bit with us. And in that he talks about some important discussions when it comes to asanid, narrations, and the science of hadith. Very, very important works that we have here. And it's the founding works. Okay, when we speak about, what are the earliest texts that we have, and there's some before this also, But what the earliest texts a person can look at today and be like, oh wait, that's علوم الحديث they're speaking about. Okay, as we know it today. And these are some of the texts. Okay, stage 2 is مرحلة الاستقلال والجمع. The stage of independence and compilation, where scholars are now figuring out, wait a minute, we need a science for this. They realize that we have a science for fiqh, we have a science for aqidah, we also need a science for hadith, an independent science, an independent discipline, where we're gonna create separate books, dedicated works, where the science becomes a lot more organized, a lot more systematic for students to now learn from. Okay, manual starting to come out during this stage for later generations and students to rely upon when they go out and do verification of a hadith. Started in the middle of the 4th century after Hijrah, all the way until the beginning of the 7th century after Hijrah. Okay, this is when, during this period, when Mustalah al-Hadith became his own science. Dedicated books and literature was being written about specifically for Mustalah Hadith during this time. Okay, so scholars, they started to compile works, okay, specifically devoted to Mustalah terminology, as qawaid, usul al-Hadith, principles of Hadith. Okay, and so these books were distinguished by collecting the statements of earlier scholars. Where did they get this from? They got it from the people before them, the people from stage number 1. It wasn't something new. All we're seeing is scholars relying on scholars. And this is something you'll see, subhanAllah, always in the science of hadith. Sometimes in fiqh, a faqih is able to come up with something new that no one before him had come up with. You'll find these other sciences, okay, where you know, a faqih, or maybe someone who's in usul al-fiqh, the science of usul al-fiqh, to be honest, they can. It's not something bad I'm saying. It's actually, you find it where a scholar is able to come and is able to develop something new, okay, that none before him had found. You find it in aqidah sometimes, and aqidah happens a lot because there's so many new things coming out. But in hadith, you'll find is always relied upon by the person before them, which is why the science of hadith is so amazing, beautiful, because wherever you find something in a book, you'll always see that scholar took it from somewhere else, someone before him, and that scholar before him took it someone before him, and before him, and before him, all the way until it reaches the companions themselves. Okay, so this science, the study of hadith is golden in that sense. Okay, it's a traditional science in the sense that it follows a set way of tradition. When I say tradition, I mean generations following the generations before them. So they will rely upon the work of the works before them. Okay, and like that, they will start to write separate books when it came to the science of hadith. Some of the books that came out during this stage is, for example, المحدث الفاصل بين الراوي والواعي للرام هرمزي, and he was the first ever person to write a separate book when it came to Mustalah al-Hadith, the science of hadith. Okay, so this guy is quite. We'll speak about him later on. He's quite an important figure. He passed away in 360 after Hijri. And he was the first ever person, and some scholars say different, but no, most of the scholars of hadith say it was this guy, Aram Harmuzi, who was the first ever person to write about the sciences of hadith in a separate book. Before him, it was just in other books, for books of fiqh, books of hadith, like recorded hadith, compilation, or aqidah, or maybe. Another example of a book is معرفة علوم الحديث لأبي عبد الله الحاكم. Another by الكفاية في علم الرواية, Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi. This guy is a very, very important figure. Everyone sort of relied upon him in the stages after. After Khatib al-Baghdadi, you'll find, and he hadith, everyone relied upon him. Okay, and we'll see that a lot. Where a lot of scholars that came after him, that wrote books about ulum al-hadith, they used to rely upon the works of al-Baghdadi, Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi. Okay, we have another book by Qadi Iyad, Al-Ilma' ila ma'rifat usul al-riwayat wa taqid al-sama'. Important work, Al-Ilma', which is known as a foundational work when it came to the science of hadith. Now, what do you recognize about these books compared to the first stage? So these books are separate. These scholars came out and they said, we want to write a separate book about the sciences of hadith, which is why we find words like al-rawi, ulum al-hadith, ilm al-riwayah, okay, usul al-riwayah. These are separate books that are being written about, which is different to the first stage. Now, stage number 3 is التهذيب والتحرير. The stage of refinement and editing. In stage number 2, by the end of the 7th Hijri, by the 7th Hijri, علوم الحديث had reached a stage where it had matured. Okay, it had already been organized, structured in a way where students are able to learn from, scholars are able to benefit from. Books had been written separately. The science had reached its peak, you could say. Okay, and so during this stage, the scholars will now just refine. They will edit it. Okay, they will do مختصرات, like the one we're going to study, اختصار علوم الحديث. They would do تهذيب, which is basically تهذيب is basically reconstructing, you could say, constructing it in a well-mannered way. That's what تهذيب is. Okay, constructing it in a well-mannered way that people can take from. Refining and editing is what was happening in stage number 3, and you could say that we're living in stage number 3. It's an endless stage. Not anything that comes after it. Okay, why? Because there's not really anything that you can do new that someone already hasn't spoken about, unless you find something, I don't know, like a secret manuscript that has been touched by, Allahu A'lam. It's very difficult to happen. This began around the beginning of the 7th century after Hijri, and during this period is where all the material of the second stage was just worked on, defined, organized, arranged. Tahdhib was done. اختصارات abridgments were created. Definitions, technical terminologies were refined, standardized, which is why during this stage a lot of new terminologies were found. They say it's during this stage that we finally hear about the terms like Hassan and all these other terms that we find were found in this stage. But it's not anything new, just refining it. It's just refining some the things that the scholars mentioned in the previous stage. Okay, principles, rules, classifications were formulated. Okay, and these sorts of things. For example, we have the famous book which is called علوم الحديث, or this is called معرفة علوم الحديث. It's also known as مقدمة ابن صلاح. مقدمة ابن صلاح. Ibn Salah is a famous scholar of hadith who passed away in 643 after Hijri. He is known as like the standalone guy when it comes to the science of hadith. Okay. They say that his work, basically what it did was it not arranged, but it refined, edited, standardized, arranged, systematically organized everything that came before him. That's what Ibn Salah did. And that's why his work is so important. If my camera was on, I would have showed you from the maktaba. It would be nice if you do like a nice little tour of my maktaba. I have all these books. We will do it one day. Okay, so Ibn Salah, what does he do? He sits down and he decides, I'm going to write a book, علوم الحديث, called معرفة علوم الحديث. And what I'm going to do is, all the works before me, I'm just going to make it to one book. Standardize علوم الحديث. And so we say that any book that was written after this book, Ibn Muqaddim Salah, or معرفة علوم الحديث, was basically just going back to Ibn Salah. There was no need to go to anyone before Ibn Salah anymore, because Ibn Salah did all the hard work. He standardized, did tahdhib, refined everything that came before him. So why are we going to go back? Why are we going to go back there for? Let's just look at the work of Ibn Salah. What they say, or the scholars of hadith say, that any book of Ulum al-Hadith that was written after Ibn Salah was just basically based on his book. From those books is what? The book that we're studying now, اختصار علوم الحديث, where Ibn Kathir comes and he does a mukhtasar. What is a mukhtasar? An abridgment. Okay, an abridgment of Ibn Salah's book. I will speak about that next week, inshallah. Okay, so this is like an important text. Okay, important piece of literature when it comes to the sciences of hadith. So important. Okay, one of the mashayikh, he told us that there's 3 books that if you complete, then you've basically mastered ulum al-hadith. Maybe write these down. The first is Muqaddim ibn Salah, which is this book here, or Ma'rifat ulum al-hadith ibn Salah. The second is العلة الصغير للترمذي. العلة الصغير للترمذي. So the first is معرفة علوم الحديث by Ibn Salah. The second is العلة الترمذي by Imam al-Tirmidhi. And the third, they say, is Al-Fiqh al-Iraqi. Al-Fiqh al-Iraqi. If you do these three things. Alfiyat al-Iraqi is, what is Alfiyat al-Iraqi? It's lines of poetry made by Imam al-Iraqi. And who did he base it off? He made lines of poetry based on Ibn Salah's book. So he said, I'm going to take Ibn Salah's book, I'm going to make it into lines of poetry. 1,000 lines. That's essentially what Iraqi did. So you can see Ibn Salah, the amount of radiallahu anhu, as Allah accept his work, how much he influenced scholars that came to him. 3 books. Scholars say that if you master these 3 books, you have mastered Ulum al-Hadith, the science of Hadith. And all that's left for you now is just to go through the books of Sunnah and do tatbiq of it. Do practically kind of do it yourself. We have a book by Imam al-Nawawi, Irshad Tullab al-Haqa'iq ila Ma'arif Sunnah Khayr al-Khala'iq. We have another book by Imam al-Nawawi also, التقريب والتيسير لمعرفة سنن البشير النذير. And we have another book by Imam al-Zarqi, which is called Al-Nukat ala Muqaddim ibn Salah. What does Nukat mean? Who knows what Nukat means? Anyone know what Nukat means? What does Nukat mean? Okay, no, okay. I mean, the way we use nukat, or we say nukta. Nukta is like a nice little pun or a joke. Not like that. A nukta is basically slight areas where that the author maybe sees that he could have changed something there. هذه نكتة يعني ممكن تغيرها. Imam al-Zarkashi, he would point out some areas of Ibn Salah's work, Muqaddim ibn Salah, where Ibn Salah maybe could have changed a word. Or he has a commentary on some of the things that he said and says, you know what, maybe we could have used another word. Maybe we can change this word. What he said here wasn't exactly correct. Let me have a look at it and change it. Okay. What he said here, it needs a bit of explanation. That's what nukat means. That's what nukat means. Okay. And so we have a lot of them. We have so many of these nukat of Ibn Salah. So Imam Zarkashi came. He said, I love this work of Ibn Salah so much, but there's a few areas that maybe need a little bit of tweaking. So instead of me writing my own book, Ibn Salah did such an amazing, awesome job. I'm just going to take his book and write nukat. Take his book on the sides of the pages. I'll just write a few points here and there. Okay. Some other books that we have. We have the book of At-Taqeed wal-Idah lima utlika wa ughliqa min Kitab Ibn Salah. Again, Imam al-Iraqi comes and he loves Ibn Salah's book so much. Okay, where he says, I want to do At-Taqeed wal-Idah lima utlika wa ughliqa min Kitab Ibn Salah. Where I'm just going to look at some of the things that, some of the masail that he mentioned and just go over them. He needs a bit of explanation. He needs a bit of tweaking. Okay, you can see all these scholars are coming. What are they doing? They're basing their work on who? Ibn Salah's work. And then we have another work by Imam Iraqi also, the Alfiyah that he made, Alfiyat al-Iraqi, which is 1,000 lines of poetry, beautiful lines of poetry as well. Okay, where he writes, he basically takes Ibn Salah's book and he makes it into lines of poetry. Beautiful lines of poetry, 1,000 lines. Then we have also Ibn Hajj al-Asqalani comes and he loves Ibn Salah's book so much. He does also a nukat. He's a nukat ala Kitab Ibn Salah. There's some areas that Ibn Hajj is like, okay, I love this book so much, but here and there needs a bit of tweaking. So I'm going to fix it. That's what nukat means. Then we have Nukhbat al-Fikr, the famous text Ibn Hajj wrote. Nukhbat al-Fikr, the small text. Okay, what did he base it off? He based it off Ibn Salah's book. He based it off Ibn Salah's book. We have also Nuzhat al-Nadhar, which is basically a sharh, explanation of Nukhbat al-Fikr. Fath al-Mughith bi sharh Alfiyat al-Hadith. Fath al-Mughith is basically just explanation of Alfiyat al-Iraqi, of this guy here. So this guy here, Shamsuddin al-Sakhawi, wrote explanation of the 1,000-line poetry, and 1,000-line poetry goes back to who? Ibn Salah. So you can see everyone's just taking from Ibn Salah at this stage. Then we have also Tadrib al-Rawi fi sharh Taqrib al-Nawawi or Nawawi al-Suyuti. So Taqrib al-Nawawi was a book written about the science of Hadith. Tadrib al-Rawi means literally the exercise book of the narrator of Hadith, where he speaks about some important principles and the science of Hadith in general. This is something that we studied in Jamia. I don't think it's taught anymore, but it's something that they classically teach in universities now. Tadrib al-Rawi. طيب. Okay, so these are like the main sources. Okay, and any kind of book after this, there's so many that we didn't talk about. Okay, there's so many other books that we didn't speak about, but generally, what do we say is they take from Ibn Salah. Any book that came after Ibn Salah normally takes from it. Okay, أهم مصادر علوم الحديث. What are the major sources of علوم الحديث? When we're looking at the the books of علوم الحديث, where did it come from? Where are they taking it from? Where are they understanding the science from? Where are they inferring the science from? Number one is كتب الرواية, the book of narration, meaning the books of hadith, the collections of hadith. For example, Bukhari and Muslim, the Sunan al-Arba'a, the Masanid. How so? I'll tell you how. I am now going to act as a hadith scholar. I'm very far from it. Okay, but let's just say, on role play, I come now and I open up Sunnah Tirmidhi. And I notice that Imam Tirmidhi sometimes he do like tasih and tad'if. And for all of you guys that have a copy of Imam Tirmidhi at home, or even online, open it. You'll see that Imam Tirmidhi sometimes he does commentaries. He'll say that this hadith is such and such, and this hadith has this issue and that issue, and this hadith is good and this hadith is bad. He'll say that. I come now and I realize, wait a minute, Imam al-Tirmidhi always tends to say that this hadith is weak when there's this person in the chain of narration. So now I keep doing that. I'm looking at this narration, this book of Tirmidhi, and I'm noticing this pattern. So now what am I going to do? I'm going to infer that any time this person is seen by Imam al-Tirmidhi is classed as weak. Okay? And this is exactly what the scholars of hadith do. They look at the collections of hadith, Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Majah, and they notice certain things from the chain of narrations, from the commentaries that they made and stuff like that. And then they base principles off of those. And that's where they get ulum al-hadith from. So one source of ulum al-hadith. Another one is books of kutub al-rijal. Don't worry. Just because it's kutub al-rijal, the book of men, doesn't actually mean that there's women in there. There's not. Okay, it's full of women. Okay, it's not just men. It's called kutub al-rijal just because it is. Okay, what is rijal here? This is not. It doesn't actually mean men. It just means narrators of hadith. In fact, my current thesis, which I'm looking at, is Nisa fi siyari a'lam al-nubala. My current thesis I'm working on right now, it's a piece of work I'm doing now, is looking at the women of hadith, or the women mentioned in Siyar A'lam al-Nubala. Siyar A'lam al-Nubala, if I turn my camera on, I would, but it's a massive, probably the biggest one we have today. Or not this big actually, but it's a massive work by Imam al-Dhahabi, where he basically talks about figures in Islam. This person is that, this person was known to lie, this person was really good, this person was praised, this person was criticized, etc., etc. So many books like that. Tahdhib al-Tahdhib, Tahdhib al-Kamal, and the books go on. Okay, where scholars would come and they would take all these narrations they find in Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, any other collection of hadith, or even outside of that, and they'll write about them, write biographies about them, where they were born, who did they take from, who were the teachers and the students, where did they travel, what were they known for. This is what we need. We need this because we build of hadith based on these. Okay, we have a whole entire science is called al-jarh wa al-ta'dil, the science of narrative and criticism. Criticism and accreditation, means to praise someone. Also, another source is the books of hadith criticism, kutub naqd al-marwiyat. Okay, scholars would come and they'd write about why a hadith is weak, why this hadith has an issue. There's an issue in the narration of this hadith. For example, kutub al-ilal, ilal ad-Daraqutni. Okay, so many ilal al-Tirmidhi, all these books. Kutub al-Takhrij also. Okay, Faharis, and we'll speak about all these books. We'll open them up. We'll have a look. Why they're so important? Why they're important? Because these scholars came and they said, I found this hadith to be weak because of such and such. We need to know that. We need to know that so we can add it into our bank of ulum al-hadith. Okay. The fourth source is independent works of ulum al-hadith. Al-kutub al-mufrada fi ulum al-hadith. For example, books written mustalah al-hadith that are written beforehand. For example, Muqaddim al-Salah, Nukhbat al-Fikr. We need to rely on these because they give us important principles and rules we can take away from the big news in the science of hadith. Okay, I'll take the question. I want to finish off here. And also, ulum al-hadith is also taken from other sciences. Some people think that ulum al-hadith is just taken from hadith. No. The science of hadith also delves into matters of usul fiqh. I will see how that happens. It's actually amazing how it happens. It also delves into matters of tafsir, delves into matters of aqidah, delves into matters of fiqh. Okay? And I'll remind you, there's a famous quote teachers tell me. Perhaps I believe maybe some of the hadith used to say it. They used to say that the muhaddith, the scholar of hadith, is like a pharmacist. And the faqih, the scholar of fiqh, is the doctor. Who do you think is more important? The doctor or the pharmacist? Any doctors here? What do you guys think is more important? The doctor or the pharmacist? The doctor. Each has their job. Okay, I like what you're doing there. Some people are typing. Some people to type. Someone said pharmacist. I like that. Okay. The truth is, each has his own job. One will find it very difficult without the other. If the doctor didn't have access to a pharmacist, his job will become very, very difficult. And a pharmacist, if he has a pharmacy, but no doctors are coming to him to prescribe medicine from his pharmacy, he's going to be out of business. Okay, so each relies on the other. But which one do you guys think? I already said it. Did I say it? Did I say which one is who? I'll say it anyway. The muhaddith is the pharmacist in this example. Muhaddith is the pharmacist. And the doctor is the faqih. The muhaddith is the pharmacist, and the doctor is the faqih. Because the pharmacist, what does he do? He prepares the medicine. He makes sure that this medicine is going to work. It's not toxic. It doesn't have any toxins. It's not going to kill the patient. Okay, it's gotten rid of all of the unverified ingredients. He's verified all the ingredients, and he's created a pill out of it or a tab out of it, and he passes it over to the doctor, the faqih, and the doctor can now prescribe it. He can inject people with it. He can send it out. Okay, and that's the faqih does, doesn't it? He takes the verified sources of the muhaddith. He takes the muhaddith says, and then he applies it into rulings. Applies it into rulings. And likewise, the same with the aqidah and also tafsir. Tafsir relies on asanid many times. Aqidah definitely. Usul fiqh also. So you'll find these intertwining ideas of the scholars of hadith and their other sciences. That's the end of the lesson, inshallah. And next week, bi'idhnillah ta'ala, we're going to be starting the book اختصار علوم الحديث. By now, everyone should have a very, very good understanding of how this science came about, علوم الحديث. Where did it begin? Where are we now with it? Some important principles and books, the importance of science, where we take you from, etc., etc. So everyone should be grounded in the muqaddimah fi ulum al-hadith, the introduction to al-hadith. And next week, I think we're grounded enough, we know enough, we can have a look at what Ibn Kathir and his work contributes to the science of hadith. Jazakumullah khair. I'll answer your questions now. If anyone has any questions, then you can ask. So someone asked, did Ibn Salah miss anything like other previous? Yes, he did. He might miss something, and that's where these nukat come. The nukat of Ibn Hajar, the nukat of Zamakhshari, where they come and they say, "Oh, Ibn Salah, maybe you could have added that here. Maybe you could have added that here." Tweaking stuff and adding stuff. Okay, like are the previous books used more? Of course, there might be some things that were missed out by Ibn Salah. Okay, but generally speaking, and the vast majority of scholars that came after Ibn Salah just relied on his work. Just relied on his work. When it came to ulum al-hadith, specifically mustalah, I'll be honest. What is masanid? Masanid are books that gather all the asanid. That's exactly it. It's a book that gathers asanid. Okay, books that masanid, and also narrators. We'll look at some. Someone said, in Pakistan, you could be a pharmacist even if you're a high school dropout. I wouldn't want to live in Pakistan. I'm joking. I think Pakistan is an amazing place to live. Okay. But it's worrying that anyone could be a pharmacist. Jazakumullah khairan, guys. And I'll see you guys next week. If anyone has a question, you can stay and ask. I'm more than happy to answer your questions. If not, we'll see each other next week. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. If you're staying, you can unmute your mic and you can ask. It might be easier than me having to wait and wait for you to type. Barakallah feekum.